Welcome to another event by Methods in Question, Epistemologies of Gender and Sexuality Seminar Series, and thank you all for coming. I am Hakan Sandal, as some of you might know. I am a third-year PhD student here at the Center for Gender Studies and the convener of this seminar series. Just to let you know, this seminar is being video recorded and will be up on our website, methodsinquestion.co.uk very soon. And so it's my big pleasure to introduce our speaker today, whose activism and scholarly work not only inspired people around the world, but also made many people regard methodology as a site of struggle. Dirik has recently completed her PhD at the Department of Sociology at the University of Cambridge. She has been researching the Kurdish women's liberation movement and women's struggles in different parts of Kurdistan for several years. Occasionally writing on freedom struggles in Kurdistan for different international outlets, she is also actively involved in the efforts of the movement to connect with women's struggles around the world. Today, drawing on her own research and organizing experience, Dilar's talk will address the ways in which Kurdish women's representations of their own struggles are being policed and subjected to disciplinary discursive practices in different spaces. I'm personally excited about this seminar, which I believe speaks to the heart of this series. So please join me in welcoming Dirik.
Thank you so much, Hakan, and thanks everybody for coming here and taking your time from your busy schedules. I'm a bit nervous about this talk because it's much more emotionally exhausting. It has been the preparation for this talk, and you'll see why in a second. So I want to start with a quote by one of the people that I have interviewed during my fieldwork in Kurdistan. Many journalists and university researchers come here. Many want to write theses about us. Sometimes their questions sound like psychological personality tests at medical clinics. How do you conceive of this? Is this so, or rather so? On a scale from 1 to 10, where would you put this? There was an American woman who wanted to write about us, the Kurdish women fighting ISIS. When I told her that her research looks like a psychology test, she was surprised and caught off guard. Psychology has standardized categories to define and classify humans and their behaviors. When something is outside of these categories, they struggle to understand its meaning. They would ask about our social relationships, our friendships, our attitude towards leadership, our concept of women. Where on the scale would you put this? Where do you put the leader? Where do you put your friendship? What is more important, being Kurdish or being woman? They try to categorize, measure, and quantify. That is because contemporary social science restricted the character of humans to such standards. To genuinely understand, they need to overcome their positivist approach to science and to the human. It gets annoying. They treat us like objects. They are often not concerned about understanding issues, but about their work being read. It's a business, which is why it's so disturbing. Because of their Orientalist views, because they believe Europe to be so free, they do not understand the meaning of the levels that women have achieved so far. They need to radically turn their understandings upside down. I recorded these words in the late summer of 2015 when I stayed with the women's guerrilla unit of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, in Iraqi Kurdistan. At the time, many fascinated journalists, filmmakers, and researchers were traveling to Kurdistan to meet these women who are labeled as terrorists in countries like the UK. But less than 2 years after I recorded these words of Kurdish guerrilla fighter Gulen Gulveda, mere kilometers away from the so-called Islamic State, she died in clashes with the Turkish army. Writing about the movements like the Kurdish women's liberation struggle does not only mean writing despite the state, writing over history denied, writing against the normalization of violence and oppression. It also means writing about a movement that has countless works of critique of positivist social sciences, of liberalism and capitalist modernity. A movement with volumes of books to describe an ideology that considers patriarchy as the primary contradiction leading to social unfreedom. It means writing about a women's movement that develops genealogy as a science of women and life, as an alternative to the dominant social science paradigms. It means writing about a large area in northern and eastern Syria in which thousands of autonomous women's communes, cooperatives, assemblies, and academies have formed to declare the women's revolution. And it means writing about an army that calls itself women's liberationist, with a male leader who refers to feminism as the uprising of the oldest colony. We don't have time to get into any of these topics today, and sometimes we never do. Because writing about the Kurdish women's struggle also means asking oneself, who is my research for? when its protagonists, like Gulam, are constantly dying? For us as Kurdish women, it also means taking on a storm of Orientalist, positivist, and male-dominated knowledge production. It also means sometimes struggling against other feminists who, until recently, didn't know about the existence of a 40-year-old radical, popular women's struggle in Kurdistan until recently, but who, due to certain privileges, can somehow dismiss it discursively as not being feminist enough to even acknowledge or engage with, which is why, unfortunately for everyone involved, white men have shaped a big part of the representation of Kurdish women in media, academia, and culture with the war against ISIS in the recent years. So when Hakan first asked me to be part of the seminar series, I was of course very happy to contribute with a talk. As I prepared myself for today, I caught myself wondering how to best structure my talk in a way that would not allow what I have to say to be dismissed as propagandistic, ideological, partisan, or not academic enough, all of which are terms that other feminist academics have used towards me in the last 2 months alone. While any academic work can and should be criticizable, it is clear that these are politically charged words to describe another person's work. They are also not incidents that I just happen to experience. Many other Kurdish women, and in general, women of color working on their communities in ways that focus on their resistance and not on their victimhood, will be able to tell similar stories. So I want to start with a disclaimer, partly as a reminder to myself, to protect myself from unintentional self-censorship that often happens in the face of mechanisms that attempt to police our own portrayals of our own stories, which will be the topic of my talk today. I am a Kurdish woman, a young Kurdish woman, a feminist, a child of a highly political community, a product of an oppressed, colonized society under constant threat of genocide. In the recent years, thousands of Kurdish women have been abducted, raped, and sold as sex slaves by groups that use sexual violence as a tool of war. And perhaps I'm only here with you today in this place overflowing with privilege and exclusion because I grew up in Europe, as my family and I had to seek asylum when I was a child. So, close friends of mine, as well as people I had interviewed or spent meaningful time with during my fieldwork, were either killed by the Islamic State or by the Turkish army as I was writing up my thesis to obtain a title from an educational system that in many ways either ideologically criminalizes my community or is financially involved in arms trade with mass murderous regimes. We take sides in our research, not because we are chauvinists, because we believe we have the best struggle in the world, not because we're nationalists, but because in the era of groups like ISIS, of gendered and nationalistic state violence, of daily so-called honor killings in our own community, Kurdish women like myself, for their own physical, mental, emotional, and historical survival, rely on legitimizing, protecting, and defending the women's liberation struggle in Kurdistan. Expecting people like us to do so-called objective research is expecting us to split our personalities. And as we shall see, obstacles that Kurdish women are facing when talking about their own movements, struggles, and efforts to change their societies are often expressions of wider practices, attitudes, and mechanisms that delegitimize theories, argumentation forms, assumptions, or struggle concepts that develop in movements or struggles, especially those that challenge dominant systems of power. In fact, even when stating their intention to resist gendered Orientalist modes of representation, especially in the light of problematic portrayals of Kurdish women fighters or women who have experienced violence by groups like the so-called Islamic State in recent years, by nevertheless employing positivist attitudes towards social processes, feminists often perpetuate hierarchies of knowledge production in their work on the Kurdish women's movement. But let us first consider political and ethical issues that inform research on Kurdish women's struggles, before moving on to questions concerning epistemology and methodology. Now, I will deliberately refrain from specifying people, works, or incidents in support of my argument, not only because it's not just individual works, but a discursive framework that all of them together produce that constitute problematic modes of legitimization and representation, but also out of fear of antagonizing possible allies by challenging them, which is another major obstacle to our knowledge production, and which we may talk about later. One reference I do want to make, however, is an interview conducted with Judith Butler in 2017 on vulnerability. This is because her words carry the potential to render the Kurdish women's movement more vulnerable than any critique I could formulate could ever render her vulnerable. When asked about her thoughts on Kurdish women who die fighting against the so-called Islamic State, Butler, recognizing the preferability of deliberate mobilization of vulnerability that Kurdish women engage in when arming themselves against ISIS over the unwilled vulnerability to violence that they would otherwise be exposed to, Butler asks, I understand this at a certain level, although I remain someone committed to nonviolence as an ethical and political practice. I know this probably makes me seem naive or privileged or both, but the means by which we oppose a certain political organization of the world is also the means by which we make a new world. And violence does not build a new world. At the time of Butler's interview, thousands of Kurdish, Arab, Syriac women in the region, as well as countless Turkish revolutionaries like Ayşe Deniz Karacagil, and internationalists such as Black German communist Ivana Hoffman, British anarchist, anti-fascist Anna Campbell, an Argentinian socialist and medical doctor educated in Cuba, Alina Sanchez, who was my friend, were losing their lives in the struggle against ISIS and similar groups, indeed making themselves vulnerable for what they themselves described as a struggle for justice. Using weapons not just as a means to an end, to make a new world, as implied in Judith Butler's short but authoritative comments, but also to protect precious existing worlds from extinction. I want to quote one of these Kurdish women fighters that I interviewed in 2015. She said, a female sociologist came here a while ago. She had already defined everything in her mind before speaking to us. But to legitimize and authorize her claims, to be able to say that she collected her evidence from the source, she needed to do her so-called fieldwork. She wanted to fit us into the template in her head. In her eyes, we were objects. We were strange, poor women. She kept insisting that we would not have gone to the mountains if we did not have to. If we had not suffered, if we had adequate access to education, etc., we would not have come here. Although such fieldwork is a progressive method in social science, it is completely detached from history and thus cannot expose our realities. This way, you will only reach a middle ground between your prejudices and the words told you by another person. Pelchin, a guerrilla from the genealogy committee in the mountains, told me, months before the camps, where they were reading about things like critical theory, were bombed by the Turkish army. It is important to stress that the hardships that movements face vis-à-vis state violence do not mean that people must refrain from asking questions or conducting critical research. But we cannot deny the representative powers inherent to academic work on people with little access to bodies of literature being produced about them. As feminist Maori scholar Linda Tuhiwai-Smith says, representation is important as a concept because it gives the impression of the truth. Representation of our struggles will have concrete consequences for our own ability to think and speak about ourselves. What may be a topic of interest for someone else is our own fight for a place in history. The ways in which our struggles are being written about can actually cost us valuable, sometimes life-saving solidarity. I would argue that feminists should be generous and engaging, not policing in their treatment of concepts that women in struggles develop and employ, either tactically or strategically, to advance struggles in their complex and often traumatized communities. After all, feminism is not just an academic exercise. Its primary legacy is one of social justice, solidarity, and liberation. Another thing to keep in mind is that despite many women's calls for solidarity between struggles, patriarchy often finds creative ways of realizing itself to the point of appropriating women's struggles for their own purposes. Over the course of the years in which Kurdish women's militancy, for instance, became more visible and respected and talked about, Kurdish women, like myself, often noticed how Kurdish men, in the name of progress and revolution, began to weaponize the image of the female fighter against other Kurdish women, whom they rendered to be representative of supposedly classical womanhood, however they may define that. Likewise, many non-Kurdish men fetishized Kurdish women and in turn dismissed women's struggles in their own communities. These examples demonstrate the importance of considering the responsibility of critique under the male gaze. I will speak later about the value in finding alternative ways of articulating critique that democratize knowledge and create an atmosphere of mutuality rather than safeguarding privileges through academic vocabulary. Let us just quickly zoom in on some of the problematic research practices that Kurdish women are often confronted with. Overtly dismissing Kurdish women's portrayals of their own struggles as subjective, biased, emotional, ideological, uncritical, and so on, in conferences, Q&A sessions, publications, reviews, admissions procedures, media articles, etc. This is something that I have experienced and many of my friends have experienced. With feminist language is a very easy tool of epistemological domination and is part of a patriarchal understanding and approach to knowledge and science. There are ways of exposing our vulnerabilities to an already violent atmosphere and policing our joy when discovering the power of our own individual selves, especially in organized struggles, which are naturally full of contradictions and difficulties. But more importantly, these terms resemble those that have been historically employed by male-dominated systems to portray women as irrational, less intelligent, unfit to decide for themselves, and untrustworthy. One common tendency is the sheer refusal in many feminist works on the Kurdish women's movement to acknowledge the role played by imprisoned Kurdish political leader and thinker Abdullah Öcalan in the history of the women's struggle in Kurdistan. My friend Solzat Kocher, a young Kurdish women's rights activist based in Germany, criticized in her article called Solidarity with the Kurdish Struggle Without Öcalan, the Eurocentrism of feminists who, without actually engaging with what Öcalan has to say, expect Kurdish women to abandon their insistence on the imprisoned leader, who is a man, and thus perpetuate the idea that Kurdish women are self-victimizing and unable to think for themselves. Isolating the Kurdish women's movement from Öcalan, some feminists have started writing their own version of a history that is not theirs to distort. The Kurdish women's movement is also often criticized as being essentialist in its approach to gender. While this might be a valid and important criticism, it is problematic to articulate such phrases if one has not actually adequately engaged with the women's movement's own decades-old theorizing, and if one is also not aware of ongoing debates, discussions, and educations within the movement that are happening. And engagement, they are actually very much discussed about in Kurdish women's political spheres, but they are assumed to be non-existent simply because they are inaccessible to the researcher. Movements are not static. They are full of debates and conflicts and contradictions and full of different opinions. Assuming priorities and intentions of struggles is not only essentializing them, but also can lead to false conclusions, which is, of course, bad academic practice. Also, many researchers contact activists of the Kurdish women's movement to access the field. That's quite normal. They ask for help, resources, answers, support, and other kinds of assistance, sometimes in quite entitled ways. One time, in front of a large audience, a feminist researcher asked me, "Can you please explain why you guys don't have sex?" in reference to the politically motivated sexual abstinence of guerrilla fighters of the PKK. I felt so put on the spot and violated. Kurdish women's activists, this is just one extreme example of many such incidents. Kurdish women's activists can often feel exhausted, exploited, and simply violated in their privacy when researchers are unable to interact with women from struggles without employing the gaze of research at all times. When power dynamics like that are not addressed, it can make activists a lot more defensive and irritated by challenging questions than they otherwise would be. I include myself in this. Transparency, honesty, constant reflection of one's intentions should inform the ethics of feminist researchers when working on women who are investing their time, energy, resources, and sometimes risking their lives and well-being for a collective process of liberation. So enough about the problems. What can we do? For starters, it helps to appreciate questions quests for epistemological justice by engaging with people's struggle concepts and taking them for what they are, understanding that not the knowledge that informs people's view of themselves, their role and mission in history. After I attended the first Gynéologie conference, like I said, Gynéologie is the Kurdish women's movement's struggle to build a science of women and life as an alternative to male-dominated positive sciences. If you're interested, I can talk about that later. But there was a conference held in May 2015 in the mountains near the Iraq-Iran border that I was able to attend during my fieldwork. And I sought the perspective of women in this committee regarding social research. We discussed the ways in which social science and history writing are often in the service of ruling elites and states, to understand what kind of research ethic must be employed which does not degrade society and its members to the status of objects. To quote, "The question is, what exactly are you trying to answer? What are the blockages in contemporary social sciences, and what have they been throughout the history of science?" The dominant system is telling you what you should understand and how. We, however, think that the real aim of social sciences is to define life itself. The greatest crime of capitalism is its elimination of the definition of life. As a sociologist, the position from which you evaluate things will determine the outcome of your findings. What is sociality to you? What is democratic society? What kind of life do you want? What are its values? These can be your starting points. This was the perspective that was given to me by these women. The committee also encouraged me to overcome my fear of my research being considered not objective enough or biased, and to view my positionality as a young Kurdish woman who grew up in a political context and who's researching that same movement as a synthesis. They said, you are both the observed and the observer. You're part of the sociality as well as somehow differentiated. This can be an advantage. The most important thing for you is to be conscious and aware of it. So instead of in my own practice, instead of deconstructing women's struggle concepts or applying memorized theories on the Kurdish women's struggle, I tried benefiting from their theories and entering conversations with women. I tried to not merely describe a revolutionary movement, its history, ideology, and practice, but to attempt a practical engagement with the philosophy which informs the same protagonist, at least to the best of my ability. In this way, perhaps one could call the approach that I have taken a co-constructive one, because helping to protect a liberation movement flourish as a human being seemed more ethical to me to criticize it than to criticize it as an academic. With all my shortcomings and mistakes against victimizing narratives, I deliberately decided to highlight stories of women's resistance. And to be honest, although people may think that this would lead me to glamorize the struggle, I believe that even if I had wanted to glamorize the struggle, I would not have had the vocabulary to do justice to the unbelievably resilient and powerful stories of thousands of women recreating themselves after the feminicides committed by ISIS and similar groups. And not expressing my admiration for this resilience about these processes would have been dishonest and pretentious, because I was very much impressed. But beyond that, expecting thousands of years old relations of power and domination to dissolve within a few years is an impatient and authoritarian mode of looking at social dynamics. This is important, especially when considering that one of the main points of argument within radical circles in the past 7 years has been the labeling of Rojava, the majority Kurdish regions of northern Syria, as a revolution. People have a problem with that, either clinging on to old-fashioned, memorized formulas on the how-to of revolutions, or on capitalist views on social transformation and change that expect instant reward and tangible results without labor, care, and sustainability. Many ignore that in the lives of countless people, especially women, thousands of small revolutions started to realize themselves in a collective process. One cannot help but think that many of the people on the left, their dogmatism when understanding Rojava or anything slightly radical going on anywhere in the world resembles the authoritarianism of abusive patriarchal fatherhood that lacks all self-criticism and rejects, punishes, and disciplines its child when it does not turn out in its image. To an extent, this is also common among feminist researchers, journalists, and activists. When we look at the Eurocentric ways in which they often ask about the ways in which gender roles and relations in Rojava have actually changed. While many are genuinely curious and interested, often also for the purposes of their own struggles that they are organizing, there's often a degree of suspicion towards the women's struggle in the Kurdish regions of Syria. Is it really a feminist society? Is housework equally shared now? What about sexual freedom? These are all valid questions. But Kurdish women are often overwhelmed and irritated when what they describe as a 5,000-year-old history of domination is expected to be overcome within a few years, as if political mechanisms could change internalized mentalities just like that. So they often repeat that they're just at the start of the process. So what could, for example, a feminist analysis of the women's struggle in Rojava look like? First, one would need to acknowledge that, according to the Kurdish women's movement, revolution is not a day in the calendar that will suddenly turn social habits and relations upside down. On the contrary, revolution happens in the here and now, through the building of self-determined, autonomous, and self-defined organizedness in all spheres of life. With the paradigm shift of the Kurdish liberation movement towards radical democracy and not a nation state in the past decade and a half, the Kurdish women's liberation movement's view on social transformation has become more generous, patient, inclusive, and understanding, while trying to remain principled, uncompromising, and radical in its strategy. This is manifested in its efforts towards providing autonomous spheres for women, alongside education and rehabilitation for men, despite the most violent forms of patriarchal violence that some of them perpetuate. Our community centers, for instance, are conceptualized as spaces in which violence against women will no longer be normalized and tolerated. And yet, all activists of the movement have the mission of changing the man, or killing the dominant man, as the primary principle of socialism, in the words of Öcalan. Feminist prefigurative politics, less focused on measurable impact, provable or testable formulas, but concerned with non-exploitative forms of care, sustainability, collectivism, ecology, and the self-determination and autonomy of different identities, allow us a view of revolution that is different from authoritarian, father-like, radical politics that treat society as a group of objects to be disciplined and led. Revolutionary processes require patience, love, hope, and belief, and so does understanding these processes. Following the scheme, I have once observed someone say this problematic thing in a meeting I observed, so I conclude that things are not as flawless as they seem, is an approach that is informed by capitalist instant gratification. It can be a tool of academic critique, but it's not a mindset that movements can afford. In this vein, perhaps, representations of the struggle should also take a generous approach to the ways in which a movement can change social norms and conditions in the context of colonial violence. Feminist research cannot follow the notions and politics of truth and reality that are historically conditioned by colonialist, positivistic, and male-dominated rules on what constitutes knowledge and fact. It is interested in the actual as well as in the possible. Mantra-like repetitions of slogans like Jinjian Azadi, which is the slogan of the Kurdish women's movement and means women, life, freedom. Mantra-like repetitions of slogans like Jinjian Azadi, believed in, embodied, and died for, have over time become principles to live by. They're not propaganda for the outside world. Instead, they serve to remind people of the achievability of their own dreams. In Rojava, women still do indeed most of the housework. They experience gendered violence. They're often not taken seriously in political meetings. They continue reproducing languages and cultures that support their own oppression. But they are challenging these conditions step by step in a dedicated and collective effort. And while the systems around them may not have changed, or at least not changed enough, these women do. And that does amount to countless small revolutions that, if turned into organized and collective power, will transform communities. Research on women's struggles for liberation thus also involves an element of prefiguration, a genuine consideration of, if not faith in, the possibility of changing our conditions in the face of capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. In this sense, another slogan that's often used in Rojava, the revolution Rojava is a women's revolution, is not a definite statement on an already achieved situation, but much more an expression of feminist possibility, dependent on collective, autonomous organizedness on all spheres of life. To conclude, it is easy to criticize, dissect, and deconstruct a bold, out there women's movement that has a claim to organize nothing less than a international women's revolution while being criminalized and attacked. It is much more difficult to support this liberation process with critical tools to sustain, develop, and deepen it. But more than anyone else, feminists can, and they do. I mean, I have criticized a lot of these practices, but at the same time, there has been an incredible historic amount of feminist solidarity with Kurdistan in the recent years. That's completely not in question. But more than anyone else, feminists can break with the dichotomy between the conference and the communal assembly. We can attend celebrations, demos, meetings without our research notebooks. We can form friendships with women activists without objectifying them through our surveilling research gaze. By practically undoing the regimes that evaluate what knowledge, what kind of representation of life is valid, we can acknowledge that liberation theories, struggle concepts, do not have to be compatible with academic standards. Even without historical precedents, without measurable evidence, without perfect applications of theory in practice, empowering discourses, and yes, even so-called propaganda, help women in grassroots struggles cope with suffering and broaden their own life worlds and to realize their ability to directly act upon the world. We must acknowledge also the poverty of academia when it comes to having or even understanding knowledge that develops in practice. Women in social movements, especially those facing violent colonial contexts, may not always have the privilege to read up all about democracy theories, but they may handle social situations much more democratically than most people due to the knowledge and experience of their lived practice. At the same time, such women may not know that women in other parts of the world have articulated terms or positions similar to them decades earlier, simply because they don't have access to information in certain languages. But we can help each other develop theories for liberation, not only through one-sided critique in academic journals under the gaze of oppressive forms of knowledge production, written in languages that most women don't speak, based on academic assumptions that most don't have, but also by laying our hands practically on translation work, on popular education and alternative media, to find a language of strengthening each other's access and ability to change the world by way of solidarity. To borrow from Audre Lorde, who wrote that poetry is not a luxury for women, in particular black women and women of color, who were not meant to survive. At this crucial moment in history where patriarchal fascism seems to be on the rise on all fronts, writing, theorizing, and defending our struggle histories is not a luxury, but a site of resistance. And on the note of poetry, in praise of a diversity in our productions of knowledge, here's a little thing I wrote. I'm a bit shy about it, which will be part of a forthcoming book chapter in an anthology edited by Cindy Milstein, because I need to end on a positive note. A million years ago, people thought that the stretched index fingers of little boys in Syria and Iraq were taught to them by an army of men who had come to steal their dreams and loot their futures. In reality, however, these children were pointing at the sky, trying to spot the flying caravan of magical women in the clouds. The story goes that one day, in a dark, moldy basement in Al-Raqqa, a group of women from different countries, of different tongues, decided to come together to share their stories, away from the gaze of the male god with 4 pairs of eyes and microphone-shaped beard, who was watching. Society would refer to this as an act of conspiracy. The moment the women gathered in a circle and faced each other, surrounded by their infant children, they felt as though they had suddenly broken a charm, felt relieved of the duty to guard an ancient secret. Bewildered and shocked about this obscene sight of women in assembly, the god's mustache fell off and landed on his lap. Anxiously trying to pick up the twitching 2-legged mustache, his body suddenly froze in movement. Everyone, the tips of her 2 white braids were still smoking. They had been the cause of this epic turn of events. Defying her hunchback, she assumed a proud posture to say, "I always knew I had magical powers." The awkward pose of the man's stiff body immediately became a playground for the children. They climbed up his archaic authority shoulders, monkey hanging themselves from the arms of ancient abuse. Whoever was the first to reach his warning index finger won the game round, until they abolished winning. Sara, from the east of the river, looked at Zaman from the west, who looked back at Sara. "Take my name and let your name be mine." They exchanged names, but remained themselves, became themselves more deeply, for they had claimed the power to name themselves. The guardian's keys, shaped like body parts, were seized by Lenya, who had never been behind the wheel, but knew all about driving nonetheless. As the women and children entered the bus, one by one, Lenya hung rest until, with a devout Bismillah, she heaved her heavy body onto her new throne. Her manic laugh, as she maneuvered the bus through the sky, had a blue color and kept evil patriarchal spirits away from her precious passengers. The new Zaman spread her arms. More fabric than was already covering her body fell out from under it. With a skilled movement, she pushed herself off the ground. She was flying. Her veil were her wings. "I will be your guide in the sky. I see, I understand. I protect through knowing." In the meantime, the new Sahra, sitting on top of the bus, silently reciting forbidden fairy tales in the rhythm of the wind in her greyed hair. Farzana beside her caught a tree branch, hurling through the wind. As she uttered a prayer-like recital, her scarred fingertips turned the branch 3 times until it became a string instrument that the musicians of the world had yet to see.
her eyes on Sahra's poetry, she played a song that silenced the thunderstorm around them. Sitting in a circle with the children of the women, Rania sang a song from the women of her tribe in the desert. In the open palm of her hands, the children could see the reflection of the universe. Each scar of her large body taught them another lesson about beauty, life, and death. Nobody was here to police her knowledge. Every child that she blessed with a kiss from her wisdom-speaking lips was embarking on a trip to the school of life. Tara, who had been feeling ashamed and unclean the whole day, since she discovered blood in her underwear in the morning, and knew that this was a sign of things only getting worse from now on, lifted the ends of her long dress, swirled through the bus, jumping from seat to seat. Every spot that her blood touched began to sprout flowers in different colors: marigolds, poppies, tulips, and daffodils. I create, I become, I am through changing. It is through me that life can be. And so the flying caravan of magical women exploded notions of time and space as they set off to explore a revolution on their own terms, on their own time, on their own scale. At the doorstep of a curious place called Rojava, a woman was sweeping the floor with her broom. She continued her chore, but with a smile. I don't know what you have been told about our country, but here I am, indeed, running a household. She stopped her deed and looked up. For years I have been waiting for you, my sisters, to join me for our next assembly meeting. Without you, nobody could continue. Only with you, this broom will fly. Thank you.